What if the most important supply route of World War II was driven by people history tried to forget? How did a group of black truck drivers deliver 12,000 tons of fuel in just 54 hours, without recognition, without protection, and without rest? And why did U.S. generals struggle to understand how they pulled it off? This is the story you were never told. Not about battles, but about the roads between them. Not about heroes in headlines, but those in silence. Are you ready to follow the path history left behind? If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. The first time Maggie Johnson saw the coast of Normandy, it wasn't in triumph, it was in silence. The sea, once the site of the greatest military invasion in modern history, now stretched out in a thick morning fog, swallowing the ruins of war beneath its gray veil. There was no applause, no banners, just the quiet groan of diesel engines and the sharp scent of oil clinging to the wind. She had arrived not as a soldier with a rifle, but as a driver, a mechanic, a wrench-wielding, grease-covered woman whose skin made her both indispensable and invisible. Born in the parched fields of southern Georgia, Maggie had known two constants in her life: heat and hunger. Her father plowed the land until his back curved like the old oak outside their shack. Her mother carried the weight of poverty without letting it bend her. Maggie inherited both their strength and none of their patience. When the war came knocking, she didn't hesitate. While others debated what a colored woman could or should do, Maggie slipped on a pair of men's boots and joined the Women's Army Corps. At first, they made her clean, scrub latrines, fold uniforms, but soon, word got around that she could fix things. Engines, carburetors, leaking fuel lines, machines talked to her, she used to say. And unlike people, they didn't lie. Now, she was here, France, assigned to a logistics unit composed almost entirely of black soldiers, part of a massive, hastily assembled operation called the Red Ball Express. Its mission: supply the fast-moving Allied front with everything from gasoline to bullets, driving day and night across roads that weren't meant for such madness. The name came from the red circles painted on trucks and road signs, symbols that screamed urgency, but urgency didn't erase discrimination. Maggie's barracks sat apart. Her uniform bore the same flag, but the salute it received was always delayed. White officers called her girl or you people. Some didn't call her anything at all, but Maggie wasn't there for recognition. She was there because she knew what they didn't, that war wasn't won by medals or speeches, it was won by movement, and no one moved like the drivers of the Red Ball. On her first night, she was handed the keys to a 212-ton GMC truck, known as a deuce and a half. The thing rattled like a skeleton and smelled of burnt rubber. She climbed into the cab, glanced at the worn seat beside her, empty, and placed a photograph of her brother, Thomas, on the dashboard. He had died in North Africa. A cook, they said, killed in an air raid. The army buried him in silence and sent a folded flag in return. Maggie hadn't cried, not because she didn't feel grief, but because she'd run out of tears long before. They started at dawn, engines revving, tires screeching on gravel, hundreds of trucks, lined up like a procession of steel beasts, each one loaded to the brink with drums of gasoline. The convoy moved fast. There was no time for hesitation. Maggie gripped the wheel, her jaw tight, her eyes scanning the broken horizon. The roads were narrow, pocked with craters, and littered with the wreckage of war. Abandoned tanks, burnt-out cars, bodies buried in shallow graves just beyond the ditches. Rain began to fall. Not hard, but constant, soaking the canvas top, leaking through the seams, mixing with the sweat on her brow. Her hands slipped on the gear shift. The truck jolted forward, nearly clipping a low stone wall. She swore under her breath, steadied herself, and kept going. Behind her, another truck honked, a short, sharp blast. Maggie didn't look back. Looking back was dangerous. That night, they reached the first supply depot. Dozens of drivers collapsed beside their trucks, too tired to speak. Maggie sat on her front bumper, legs shaking, her heart still racing from a near miss with a minefield sign that had been half covered by mud. She lit a cigarette with trembling fingers and thought of home, the porch, her mother's humming, the rustle of cotton fields. But she didn't linger. Tomorrow, they'd go again, and again, and again, until the roads bled red with diesel and sweat, until the front line moved, inch by bloody inch, until someone noticed, or didn't. By the second week, the rhythm of the road had embedded itself into Maggie's bones. Sleep came in snatches, 20 minutes under the wheel well, an hour in the shadow of a fuel drum, always with boots on and hands stained with grease. There were no fixed hours, only movement. If the wheels stopped, someone would die. It was that simple. The Red Ball Express was a behemoth with no glory. Its spine was built of black men and women, driving day and night under a sunless sky, navigating roads without maps, faces without recognition. 75% of the drivers were African American, volunteers and draftees alike, plucked from the corners of a divided nation and poured into the arteries of a foreign war. They were expected to carry the burden, never the honor. Maggie knew this. She didn't flinch when she was passed over for leadership, though she'd trained 3 of the new drivers herself. She didn't react when a white sergeant refused to shake her hand after she helped him replace a snapped axle in a ditch outside Le Mans. She simply kept moving, because she understood the deeper truth. History never remembered the engine, only the destination. Her convoy that week consisted of 20 trucks, all filled to capacity with jerry cans of fuel, bound for the 3rd Armored Division near Argentan. The route passed through what locals called ghost valleys, villages burned to the ground, silent but for the crows circling above. Bridges had been blown, detours carved through farmland and mine-ridden fields. The danger was not just from German artillery or Luftwaffe strafing runs, but from the road itself, overworked, crumbling and slick with rain. One night, just past a hollow church with no roof, the truck ahead of hers blew a tire and veered into a ditch. Maggie pulled over. She knew the man, Private Elbert Moss from Mississippi, tall, soft-spoken, with a bad leg from a factory injury. He was unconscious, blood running from a gash on his forehead. She didn't wait for permission. She climbed into the cab, checked his pulse, and dragged him out as the leaking fuel hissed against the engine's heat. The truck didn't explode, but it could have. They continued after that, Elbert in the back of a rig, wrapped in a tarp. No ambulance, no dispatch, no medal, just the road, always the road, stretching out in darkness like a question no one dared ask. Back at the depot, she found her name misspelled on the manifest. J. Johnson, male. It wasn't a mistake. It was protocol. There were no women, and certainly no black women, officially authorized to drive heavy trucks in combat zones. But Maggie had stopped believing in official truths a long time ago. The mess hall refused her entry that night. Colored sections around the back, the cook said, not looking up. She sat on a crate with her tin of cold beans, listening to the laughter echoing from inside. It didn't bother her. Much. Not anymore. What gnawed at her wasn't the exclusion. It was the silence, the systematic erasure, the way no one asked her name, only what she drove, as if she were just another part of the machine. She thought of Thomas again. Thought of how he used to take apart their father's broken radio and rebuild it, even when there were no parts to spare. Things want to work, he'd say. You just have to listen close. Maggie had always listened. To engines, to silence, to the way history spoke with its absences. That week, the Express moved over 12,000 tons of fuel in 54 hours, an impossible number that no general believed until the fuel kept arriving and the tanks kept rolling. The High Command sent telegrams congratulating logistics units. None mentioned the drivers by name. None mentioned the color of the hands that gripped the wheels, or the woman with grit under her nails who kept a battalion moving. But Maggie knew, and the road knew. And somewhere, deep beneath the roar of engines and the grind of gears, something ancient stirred, the quiet defiance of those whose labor shapes the world but is never carved into its monuments. The first full convoy Maggie led began in darkness, not just the pre-dawn kind, but the deeper, pressing kind that settled in the chest when silence stretches too long. Orders had come down with no warning. They were to deliver a critical shipment of aviation fuel to an improvised airstrip east of Chartres. Intelligence warned of potential enemy remnants in the forests. Maggie didn't need reminding. She had seen the eyes of men who had driven through those woods and come out changed. There were 19 trucks in her group, all driven by black soldiers, most barely 20. Some had never left the southern counties where their names were never called for anything but punishment or labor. Now they followed Maggie's lead, their hands trembling against the wheel, eyes darting like prey unsure of the hunter's path. She didn't offer comfort, only certainty. Keep close. Don't break formation. If one of us stops, we all stop. Her voice was low, without flourish. It was enough. The road curved eastward through battered villages and orchards where the branches hung low, broken by artillery or grief. In the half-light, stone walls emerged like bones, sharp and pale, hinting at how thin the line was between order and ruin. The fuel sloshed in its containers with every turn, and every bump felt like a match being struck just beneath their feet. Maggie's truck was second in the line, close enough to the lead to relay signals, far enough to respond if it fell. She watched the brake lights ahead like a heartbeat, red and steady. Her mind drifted, not to home, but to a memory years older than the war, of her father driving their battered wagon down a dirt road as dust curled behind the wheels. He'd never looked back. Maggie didn't either. Midway through the route, the rain returned, thin and bitter. The convoy slowed as the dirt road gave way to mud. One truck veered too close to the shoulder and listed. Maggie jumped out before anyone else. She barked for logs, chains, and men. In silence, they obeyed. There was no rank here, only urgency. No one asked why she led, only if the wheels would turn again, and they did. They reached the drop point after 18 hours. The airstrip nothing more than torn earth and signal flags. The pilots barely looked at them. Mechanics swarmed the fuel drums, shouting numbers and directives. Maggie stepped aside, watching the fuel flow from truck to barrel, barrel to wing. No cheers, no thanks, just the rhythm of war, demand and supply, wound and salve. That night, they camped in a burnt orchard. Maggie sat with a map unfolded across her knees, tracing the route back. She knew it would be worse. The enemy was not just ahead, but behind. Snipers who aimed for windshields, mines that waited for a second pass, civilians who watched with unreadable eyes. She felt the tension in the air, the way old trees do before a storm, silent and unmoving but wide awake. One of the younger drivers, Private Gaines, asked her why she never seemed afraid. She didn't answer. Not because she had no fear, but because fear was irrelevant. It didn't stop the road from breaking, or the orders from coming. It didn't drain the fuel or lift the broken axle. It was just a weight, and like any weight, she had learned to carry it without flinching. When the return journey began, the fog was so thick the world shrank to headlights and ghosts. The trucks moved slowly, no faster than a man's jog. Each mile dragged like a prayer. Somewhere near Drew, they found a village where every door hung open, but no people stirred. Maggie called a halt. The drivers waited, eyes wide, fingers near triggers. There was no ambush, only absence. They moved on. Back at base, a lieutenant checked her logs, nodding but not speaking. Her name was recorded again. M. Johnson. Rank PFC, unit. Transportation. No notation for leadership. No mention of the axle she replaced, the vehicle she recovered, the lives she kept in motion. But Maggie didn't ask for recognition. She only asked for the next route. And when it came, she took the keys without a word, because the war moved on wheels, and those wheels, more often than not, rested in black hands, hands like hers, quiet, steady, unseen. By the third month, Maggie could smell an ambush before the birds flew. It wasn't superstition. It was pattern recognition, honed by repetition and loss. The smell of the road would change. Burned rubber, broken pine, the distant scent of smoke too faint to be firewood. The silence of the trees would press in, too still, as if waiting. Her body reacted before her mind could name it. Jaw tightened, fingers curled tighter on the wheel, eyes searching the treetops for shadows that didn't move. They were hauling medical supplies east toward the Moselle, a narrow route that twisted through the Ardennes. Rumors said the Germans were gone from that area. Rumors lied. She had 17 trucks behind her, each weighed down with morphine, stretchers, plasma. Wounded men needed those crates. Maggie knew how to ration breath when screams came too late. Halfway through a low valley, the world cracked. The lead truck erupted in flame, the blast lifting its cab into the air before slamming it into a ditch. Maggie didn't remember braking. She remembered diving. Metal shards sliced past her as she hit the mud, face down, heart pounding so loud it drowned out the gunfire. From the tree line, flashes of muzzle fire lit up the underbrush. She heard Private Wills shout, then stop, then nothing. The convoy scattered. Some drivers abandoned their trucks, others reversed, creating chaos that clogged the narrow road. One rig tried to turn around and jackknifed, spilling crates into the ditch. Maggie crawled to the edge of the road and saw a man, face down, legs bent wrong, helmet missing. She didn't recognize him. That made it worse. She didn't have a weapon. Most drivers didn't. They were told they wouldn't need them. Logistics weren't supposed to bleed. But the enemy hadn't read the memo. The attack lasted less than 4 minutes. A German patrol, likely left behind in retreat, executed a hit and fade, classic partisan tactics. By the time the sound faded and the smoke thinned, 3 trucks burned, and 2 drivers didn't answer roll call. Maggie pulled herself up, boots soaked, coat torn, and barked orders. She didn't shout. Her voice didn't need volume. It had weight. Men listened. Fires were doused. The wounded were lifted into the remaining trucks. No ambulance would come. No reinforcements. The mission was still on. Either they moved forward or they condemned others to die waiting. The road ahead was half blocked by the wreck. She got behind the wheel of the nearest functional rig and rammed it forward, scraping past metal carcasses until space cleared. Mud churned beneath the tires. The engine whined, but the road opened, inch by inch, under sheer will. They reached the drop point before nightfall. Fewer trucks, less fuel, fewer names answered at roll call. The officer on duty, a white lieutenant with clean boots, sighed when he saw the damage. "You people need to be more careful." Maggie didn't respond. She never did. Back at the depot, she scrubbed the blood from her sleeves with cold water and soap until her hands went numb. The sound of the brush on fabric reminded her of her mother cleaning fish, deliberate, methodical, silent. She didn't sleep that night. Neither did the others. They sat in small clusters, sharing cigarettes and silence. No stories, just smoke and breath. There was no investigation, no follow-up, no questions about the dead. Their names were penciled into the casualty logs with a note, "Killed in action, non-combatant," as if bullets asked for credentials. 3 days later, she was assigned a new route, new cargo, different river, same risk. Before departure, she returned to the bend in the road where the trees still stood too still. She left a broken taillight lens in the mud. It wasn't a memorial. It was a marker, proof that something had happened here, even if no one else remembered. The war had taught her that survival wasn't a triumph. It was a responsibility. The dead left their weight behind. Maggie carried it with every mile. Winter came not with snow, but with silence, dense and unmoving. The ground froze in patches, cracking beneath the weight of trucks that had forgotten how to rest. Engines took longer to wake. Tires lost their grip. Men's hands grew slower, stiffer. Maggie learned to layer her clothing in quiet defiance of regulations that never considered a woman's body beneath a man's uniform. The Red Ball Express had become myth among those who depended on it, and a mystery to those too far removed to understand its machinery. From August through November, more than 6,000 trucks moved across a spiderweb of makeshift routes, supplying an advancing front with food, ammunition, fuel, and hope. Behind the numbers, behind the wheels, there was Maggie. Her hands were blistered, fingernails blackened from grease and frost. Still, she rose before the sun and checked each rig in her column, not because she had to, but because failure was a privilege they couldn't afford. Trucks that faltered in the cold could become coffins. She tightened bolts with numb fingers and listened to each engine's voice like a doctor listening for arrhythmias. Some drivers called her Sarge, though she wore no stripes. Others called her Ma, though she had no children. All of them followed her. By then, Maggie had become the informal lead of her unit, though no document said so. White officers delegated without acknowledgement. If the convoy arrived on time, they praised the system. If it failed, they punished the nearest black face. She learned to anticipate problems before they formed: road collapses, fuel shortages, route changes issued at the last minute. She kept a hand-drawn map folded in her jacket, stained with oil and sweat. It was more accurate than the ones command provided. One morning, A general visited their depot, not to see them, to tour the facilities. He wore polished boots and carried gloves he didn't use. Maggie stood at attention as he passed, flanked by officers. He paused, glanced at her, then at the truck behind her. "You keep that thing running?" he asked, as if surprised. She nodded. He moved on. No more words. But later that day, a requisition came down approving new tires for her column, something she'd been denied for weeks. It wasn't gratitude, it was logistical necessity. That night, someone from the quartermaster's office handed her a letter. Her name was typed correctly, Margaret E. Johnson. No rank, but for the first time, official paper recognized she existed. It wasn't an award, just a confirmation of supplies, routed through her hands. But it was something, a crack in the wall of erasure. She folded it and placed it with her brother's photo in the tin box she kept beneath her cot. When the new tires arrived, she installed them herself, refused to let the green recruits do it. They needed to see it done right. She worked through the cold until her knuckles split. No one stopped her. No one dared. Later that week, she oversaw the rescue of a jackknifed rig under shell fire near a bridge south of Metz, crawled beneath the chassis while mortar rounds landed nearby, reattached the fuel line, restarted the engine, and drove it to safety. The officer in charge never filed a report, but every driver in that convoy told the story. Some embellished it. Others didn't need to. Maggie returned to base covered in mud and ash. She washed her face in silence, watching the water run black. No one handed her a medal, but she heard a new tone in the voices of the men around her. Not reverence, not affection, but trust, the kind born not of command, but of presence, of someone who stands when others falter. She wrote a letter to her mother that night but didn't send it. Words couldn't reach far enough. Instead, she folded the page and placed it with the others. A quiet record, a testimony in ink that someone was there, that someone bore witness. In the stillness that followed, Maggie sat on the bumper of her truck and traced the ridges of a shell fragment she'd kept, not as a trophy, as memory, cold, sharp, real, like the road, like the war, like the silence that followed even the most extraordinary acts. By early December, the front lines had devoured every drop of gasoline they could find. The tanks that punched through German defenses ran not on strategy, but on the endless labor of those behind them, on the drivers, the loaders, the unsung hands gripping frozen tools in the dark. Maggie understood this better than most. Every canister she delivered was a heartbeat extended. Another day the line could hold. And behind every heartbeat, a name that would never be spoken. But the war wasn't only being fought in Europe. News from home traveled in fragments, newspapers 3 weeks old, letters wrinkled from too many hands. Maggie read them slowly, folding and unfolding each page as if it might reveal something she missed the first time. One letter mentioned a march in Detroit, another, a church bombing in Alabama, a cousin arrested, a cousin missing. The war at home had no battlefront, just shadows, deeper and older than anything on this continent. In the barracks, someone passed around a pamphlet smuggled from the States, bold letters on the cover, double V for victory, victory abroad, and victory at home. Maggie stared at it a long time. There were photos of soldiers, black, uniformed, saluting, but none were drivers, none were women. She tucked it under her mattress anyway, next to the picture of Thomas and the shell casing from Metz. That week, the convoy carried not fuel, but food and winter gear to a bombed-out outpost in the Vosges. The route twisted through icy ridges and narrow passes where a single mistake could send a truck tumbling into the ravine. Maggie drove first, her headlights dimmed to slits, hands blistered through her gloves. Every turn was a prayer unspoken, every drop of traction a gift not guaranteed. At one checkpoint, a white MP stopped them, looked at the drivers, looked again. "You sure this is the right column?" he asked, skeptical. Maggie didn't answer. She handed over the papers. He checked them twice. "Didn't know they let you people lead convoys now." She met his eyes, unblinking, until he waved them through. No apology, no respect, just the grudging concession that the road was moving and someone had to move it. They reached the post just after nightfall. Soldiers rushed the trucks, faces hollowed by cold and hunger. One young GI took a blanket from Maggie's hands and whispered, "Didn't think anyone would come." She didn't respond, just turned and went back to the cab. The engine was still warm. That meant time was short. There was always another route, another need, another silence to fill. Back at the depot, Maggie sat alone in the maintenance shed, oil lamp casting long shadows on the concrete walls. She cleaned a carburetor with a rag she'd used since Normandy. The grease never came out. That was fine. Some stains didn't need removing. They were proof. Outside, someone argued about rations, about who got the last of the bread. Maggie tuned it out. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on a newspaper clipping folded in the bottom of her kit, a headline that read, "Negro troops prove reliable in logistics role." No names, no faces, just a statement of reluctant approval. She almost laughed. That night, she wrote another letter she wouldn't send, addressed to Thomas, told him about the mountains, about the cold, about the silence of the woods at dawn. She didn't say she missed him. That was too easy. Instead, she wrote about the men who drove with her, the ones who never thought they'd be part of anything that mattered, and how they were, even if no one would say it out loud. She folded the letter and placed it with the others. The tin box was nearly full now, a small archive of a war within a war, not of bullets, but burdens, not of victories, but proof that they had moved through this place, that they had mattered, even if history refused to write it down. It began with an order that was barely more than a whisper. A forward armored division near Bastogne was nearly out of fuel. If they stalled, the line would collapse, artillery would go silent, tanks would freeze in place. The Germans had launched a counteroffensive, and the winter was cutting deep. High command needed fuel, and they needed it yesterday. Maggie's unit was selected, not for glory, but because they always delivered. No one said it outright, but she knew. They were sent when others failed, when maps turned white and orders turned desperate. This run would be long, 54 hours, round trip, no scheduled rest, no protection, no guarantee they'd return. The convoy rolled out before sunrise, 31 trucks, heavy with aviation fuel and diesel. Each vehicle had been checked and rechecked, but Maggie knew machinery didn't care for optimism. Engines cracked in the cold. Steel grew brittle. Rubber split. She listened to every rattle and cough, memorizing the sounds as one might memorize a hymn, half reverence, half fear. They took Route D42, a winding stretch through valleys buried under snowdrifts and littered with the ghosts of old skirmishes. Fallen trees leaned like crosses, abandoned helmets poked from the ice like warnings. The first 6 hours were slow, the road slick and narrow. When visibility dropped, they moved by instinct, following the dull red glow of brake lights ahead. There was no conversation, no music, only the groan of gears and the rhythmic clunk of snow chains grinding against frost. 12 hours in, the second truck blew a tire. Maggie pulled ahead, radioed the rest to halt. The driver was shaken, but alive. She had them replace the tire in record time, 9 minutes. No ceremony, just function. Time lost was danger multiplied. They kept moving. At the 20-hour mark, fatigue blurred the world. Drivers began to drift, blink too long, forget what town they passed last. Maggie drank coffee so bitter it burned her throat. Her jaw ached from clenching. Her left boot was soaked from a leak in the cab floor. Every few miles, she tapped her horn twice. A signal. I'm still here. You're not alone. Snow fell again, thicker this time. The road vanished under it. They followed fences and memory. In the distance, artillery echoed, a reminder of what failure would cost. At hour 31, the first engine coughed and died. Maggie ordered it hitched and towed. No stopping. When they reached the drop point, the officer in charge counted the barrels, signed the papers, and waved them off without so much as a nod. Maggie said nothing. She let the silence wrap around her like a coat. The men reloaded what could be salvaged from the dead truck and began the return. On the way back, they lost 2 vehicles to ice, another to a blown head gasket. Still, they pushed on. Maggie's voice on the radio was the tether, calm, precise. Her words landed like gravel, steadying. No fear, no panic, just resolve. At the 50-hour mark, the convoy passed through a stretch of road where every tree was covered in frost, so thick it looked like bone. The light had gone strange, too flat, too quiet. Private Allen, one of the youngest drivers, whispered over the radio, "This don't feel real." No one answered, but Maggie heard him. She'd felt that same thing before, When the world grows too still, too weightless, as if holding its breath, they return to base at hour 54, no ceremony, no welcome. Most of the drivers collapsed in place, sleeping where they parked. Maggie didn't. She filed the report, checked each engine again, and washed her face with water so cold it made her teeth ache. In the maintenance log, she noted mileage, fuel loss, tire damage, no mention of fear, no mention of how close they came to being lost beneath the snow, no mention of the quiet prayer she had whispered when the first barrel was delivered. But the numbers told part of the story. 12,000 tons of fuel, delivered without delay, across ice, exhaustion, and indifference. The rest of the story remained unsaid, left in the snowbanks and tire ruts, in the heavy silence of those who endured more than history would ever write down. When the war's end was finally announced, it arrived not with fanfare, but with a cough of static over a busted radio in the corner of the depot. A corporal read the message aloud. The room didn't cheer. No hats flew into the air. The silence lingered like a fog that refused to lift. A few men stood slowly, as if waiting for someone to tell them what came next. No one did. Maggie was in the motor pool, elbows deep in an engine block when the word came down. She didn't stop working, not out of indifference, but because habit had become its own form of survival. She wiped her hands on a rag already soaked in oil and watched the others mill about, their expressions unreadable. Some were crying. Others stared off into the trees, as if the enemy might still be hiding there. Orders shifted overnight. Convoys were rerouted to carry supplies for occupation forces. Trucks were reassigned. Some drivers were told they'd be sent home soon, though no one knew what that meant. Maggie received a form letter thanking her for her service and a vague promise of future consideration. Her name was misspelled again. She packed her things in a duffel that smelled of rust and tobacco, folded her brother's photograph, placed it next to her tin of letters. The carburetor piece from Metz went in last, heavy in her hand. The cot creaked as she stood. She didn't look back. The transport ship home was crowded, loud, and restless. Men smoked too much, slept in shifts. Some talked about what they'd do first. Buy land, get married, never touch another wrench again. Maggie listened and said little. No one asked her what she planned. No one asked her anything. When they docked in New York, a brass band played 3 piers down for a regiment of white infantrymen. Women threw flowers, children waved flags. Maggie and the others disembarked through a service gate, told to wait for a truck that never arrived. A porter eventually pointed toward a city bus. That one's for coloreds. Back in Georgia, nothing had changed. The roads were cracked in the same places. The diner still had 2 doors, one for them, one for others. The newspapers mentioned victory parades, medals, generals kissing babies. There was no mention of the Red Ball Express, no footnote, no margin. She found work at a garage in Macon. The owner didn't ask for her service record. He just wanted engines that worked and silence while she worked them. Maggie gave him both. She arrived early, stayed late, never complained. Some customers asked to speak to the man in charge. She nodded and fetched the invoice. At night, she sat on her porch with a cup of coffee and the sound of cicadas thick in the air. She kept the tin box beside her chair. Inside were all the things the war had not taken, fragments of memory, of proof. She opened it rarely. When she did, she touched each piece as if confirming it was still there, that she was still there. There were moments when children from the neighborhood would wander by, chasing a ball or laughter, and pause at the sight of her. A woman alone, with calloused hands and a stare that seemed fixed on a place they couldn't see. Sometimes they asked what she did during the war. She would smile, soft and slow, and say, "I drove." Most didn't understand what that meant, and maybe that was fine, because Maggie had never needed their understanding. She had needed only one thing, to know that what she carried mattered, that the road behind her, however invisible, had shaped the one in front, not by force, but by the steady, relentless act of showing up, of moving forward, of not waiting for history's permission to exist. Years passed like dust on the edge of a window, barely noticed until the light hit just right. Maggie grew older in quiet places. Her hair grayed not with spectacle, but with the slow accumulation of mornings that began before dawn. The garage stayed open, though fewer customers remembered the war. Fewer still remembered her. But the past has a way of echoing. even when no one is listening. One morning, a young man arrived at the shop with a clipboard and a question. He introduced himself as a researcher from a small college upstate, said he was gathering oral histories from Black veterans of the Second World War. Maggie almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was strange hearing the word veteran spoken aloud in her direction. He asked if she'd be willing to talk. She hesitated. Not from fear, she had nothing left to fear, but because her story had never been treated as something worth asking about. She wiped her hands on a rag, looked at the rows of tools, at the grease beneath her fingernails, and nodded once. They spoke on the porch. He brought a small recorder, placed it carefully on the table, as if afraid it might miss something sacred. Maggie didn't speak in sweeping statements. She gave details, the sound of a convoy braking on gravel, the way snow hissed against an engine block, the color of the sky the day the first truck burned. He asked about medals. She told him there were none. He asked about commanding officers. She said their names had long since faded, but when he asked what she remembered most, she went quiet. Then, slowly, she said that the road always remembered me, even when the country didn't. The interview was archived somewhere, perhaps in a university basement or a digital file buried in an academic database. She didn't follow up. That wasn't her concern. What mattered was that the silence had been broken, even if only for an hour. Not long after, a local museum called. They wanted to feature a small exhibit on wartime logistics. Someone had mentioned her name. They asked if she had anything to donate. She brought them the tin box. Inside it, the photo of Thomas, the carburetor piece from Metz, a red ball patch, faded to almost nothing, the letter with her name spelled right, and the pamphlet with the bold headline, Double V for Victory. They asked if she wanted it back after the exhibit ended. She said no. A month later, a child stood in front of the display, staring at the photo of a young black woman in uniform, hands on the wheel of a truck, face unreadable. His mother pulled him along, but he looked back once more before disappearing into the echo of footsteps. Maggie never visited the exhibit. She didn't need to. She still drove every day, not trucks anymore, but memory. She drove through conversations, through quiet dinners, through the long silence that followed when someone asked what she'd done before the war. She let them wonder. At night, she sometimes sat with the radio turned low, the dial catching static and voices from far-off places. Somewhere, another war always loomed. Somewhere, another convoy moved through darkness. She would close her eyes and feel the rumble of wheels underfoot, the cold metal of a steering wheel, the weight of lives in the back of a truck, not as a burden, but as a truth. The road never forgot, even when history tried to. Long after the trucks stopped running, after the war medals dulled in forgotten drawers and the parades faded into old photographs, the road remained, not as asphalt or coordinates, but as something deeper, something buried in memory and marrow. The kind of road one carries even after the wheels have stopped turning. Maggie walked slower now. Age had crept in without ceremony. Her hands, once precise with bolts and levers, had stiffened, but her eyes were clear. They still measured distance without effort, still caught the slope of a hill, the turn of a bend, still knew what it meant to trace a route not on paper, but through experience etched into skin. She lived alone. A small house near the edge of town, a gravel driveway where grass grew between the stones. Most days passed without visitors. That suited her fine. The quiet was something she had earned. Yet sometimes, especially in the early hours, she would hear the echo of engines in the stillness, not in her ears, but somewhere deeper, in the space between memory and presence. One spring afternoon, a letter arrived. It bore an official seal. The handwriting was not familiar. Inside, a brief notice. A memorial had been approved. A plaque to honor the Red Ball Express would be installed at a military museum across the state. Her name would not be on it, but her units would. A dedication was planned. Speeches would be made. A crowd expected. She was invited. She folded the letter once, then again, placed it on the table beside her coffee cup, and left it there. She didn't attend. Instead, that same day, she pulled an old coat from the closet, faded, buttons missing, and walked out to the edge of town. The sun hung low, casting long shadows across the dirt road that stretched into the pines. It wasn't the same road from France, but it had the same silence, the same slow wind brushing the grass, the same absence of witnesses. She walked until the town disappeared behind her, until all that remained was the sound of gravel beneath her boots and the rhythm of her own breath. At a bend in the road, she stopped, reached into her coat pocket, and pulled out a rusted gear, small, worn, its teeth smoothed by time. She bent down and placed it in the soil, half buried beneath a stone. No marker, no name, just an offering. She stood for a moment longer, listening, not to the birds or the wind, but to the road. Because some stories aren't told in books or carved in bronze. Some are held in the weight of silence, in the memory of motion, in the miles traveled by those who were never meant to be remembered, yet made the remembering possible. And when Maggie turned to walk home, she didn't look back, because the road knew, and that was enough.